Imagine spending millions of dollars to dynamite a peaceful island into the exact shape of a human heart, only to leave it to rot overnight. Today, tourists walk through its sanitized halls, completely unaware that beneath the fresh paint lies a decaying, suffocating tomb. The walls were once choked with toxic black mold and the reeking, acidic stench of bat guano, hiding a billionaire's terrifying descent into madness. This is the grotesque, true story of a massive stone monument built for love, but violently claimed by death. Deep in the freezing, ink-black currents of the St. Lawrence River sits a colossal, rotting monument to an obsession that ended in a sudden, suffocating silence. What was originally intended to be the ultimate, immortal declaration of love instead became a grotesque stone corpse, abandoned overnight and left entirely to the merciless claws of vandals and ravenous nature. George Boldt was a titan who commanded absolute empires of unimaginable luxury, a ruthless visionary who ran the legendary Waldorf Astoria Hotel with an iron fist. He spent his days surrounded by the intoxicating scent of imported orchids, the blinding sparkle of Czechoslovakian crystal chandeliers, and the hushed, terrified reverence of thousands of servants. Yet his ultimate masterpiece was driven by a dark, consuming madness disguised as romantic devotion. His wife, Louise, was the singular object of his fixation, and for her, normal expressions of affection were entirely insufficient. It was not enough to simply buy his wife a sprawling, opulent mansion in the countryside. He felt a burning, irrational compulsion to conquer the very earth and water themselves to prove the terrifying depths of his affection. He set his sights on a modest plot of land in the Thousand Islands region and immediately decided that nature had made a grave mistake. With the arrogance of a man who believed his immense wealth made him untouchable, George aggressively ordered the island to be violently reshaped. The quiet, serene river basin was suddenly shattered by the deafening, bone-rattling roar of industrial explosives. Day after day, the crisp northern air grew thick with the choking, acidic stench of sulfur and burning cordite as teams of men drilled deep into the ancient bedrock, packing the earth with dynamite. The violent shock waves sent terrified flocks of birds screaming into the sky and left the surface of the river coated in a thick, gray film of pulverized stone. George literally blasted the jagged shoreline into the exact, anatomical silhouette of a human heart, tearing down an existing, perfectly fine estate just to clear the blood-stained ground for his monstrous vision. He poured millions of dollars into the dark, churning soil of this newly christened Heart Island, determined to erect a sprawling, six-story Rhineland fortress that belonged in a medieval fever dream rather than upstate New York. He demanded a structure boasting 120 cavernous rooms, complete with a dark labyrinth of underground tunnels dug deep into the freezing mud, massive iron drawbridges designed to keep the outside world at bay, and towering stone turrets that pierced the gray clouds like jagged teeth. The sheer logistics of a vanity project bordered on the terrifying. The clean northern air was rapidly choked by the thick, greasy black smoke of dozens of steam-powered barges relentlessly churning up the river. These massive, iron vessels groaned under the immense weight of their cargo, delivering towering slabs of imported Italian marble, delicate French silks, and massive, raw trunks of heavy oak that smelled of dark, damp European forests. The waters around the island became a chaotic, dangerous industrial zone, entirely unrecognizable from the peaceful retreat it had once been. Hundreds of desperate laborers swarmed the blasted, unnatural heart-shaped rock like ants consuming a carcass, their muscles screaming under the crushing weight of hand-cut granite blocks. They erected crude, towering wooden scaffolding that wrapped around the rising stone walls like a rotting ribcage, their heavy leather boots slipping constantly on the treacherous, frost-covered planks. The sounds of the island mutated from the gentle lapping of cold waves into the brutal, rhythmic ringing of steel hammers against iron chisels, the terrifying screaming of overloaded wooden pulleys, and the hoarse, exhausted shouts of men pushed to their absolute physical breaking point. Inside the cavernous, unfinished walls, the atmosphere became overwhelmingly suffocating. The damp air hung heavily with the wet, chalky smell of raw mortar mixing sickeningly with the sweat and blood of the workers who toiled under George's obsessive, unrelenting gaze. He demanded nothing less than absolute, terrifying perfection, poring over architectural blueprints with a feverish intensity that bordered on pure delusion. He ordered massive, load-bearing walls to be violently torn down and completely rebuilt from scratch if they deviated even a fraction of an inch from his grand, impossible design. He meticulously planned for sprawling, echoing ballrooms that would rival the most decadent palaces of Europe, a massive indoor swimming pool built to mimic the hedonistic baths of ancient Rome, and a private bowling alley to entertain the incredibly elite guests he intended to summon to his isolated, fortified kingdom. He imported the finest, most expensive craftsmen from across the globe, men who spent countless agonizing hours carving intricate, leering stone gargoyles to watch over the cold, churning waters. These grotesque, sneering faces served as silent, terrifying sentinels for a fortress that was rapidly growing completely out of control. Every single stone laid upon the frozen, dynamited earth was intended to be a flawless love letter to Louise. But as the colossal, heavy walls rose higher and higher, casting long, suffocating shadows across the black water, the fortress began to look far less like a romantic, idyllic retreat and much more like a foreboding, inescapable prison. It was a massive, sprawling monument built on shattered bedrock and choked, polluted skies, a chilling testament to a love so heavy, demanding, and utterly obsessive that it felt destined to crush absolutely everything it touched. The sheer, blinding arrogance of attempting to freeze time and conquer human mortality with imported bricks and wet mortar hung over the entire island like a thick, invisible, poisonous fog. It perfectly set the stage for a looming tragedy that absolutely no amount of money, unbridled power, or detonated dynamite could ever possibly prevent. The dark, freezing river simply watched in silence as the towering stone monster grew day by day, its icy currents swirling around the newly blasted, unnatural shores, waiting patiently for the inevitable moment when the grand illusion of control would completely shatter and the heavy, suffocating silence would finally return to claim its ultimate prize. By the time the blasted, pulverized dust finally settled over the violently reshaped shores of Hart Island, a veritable army of desperate human labor had already descended upon the scarred, bleeding earth. Exactly 300 stonemasons, master carpenters, and exhausted artisans swarmed the desolate, heart-shaped rock like ravenous ants devouring a colossal, rotting carcass. They worked frantically, driven not by passion, but by the terrifying, obsessive gaze of George Boldt, who stalked the muddy construction site like a hungry phantom demanding impossible, absolute perfection. The sheer, crushing scale of this manic vanity project quickly bordered on the profoundly terrifying, transforming the once peaceful river basin into a deafening, chaotic theater of grueling industrial punishment. Men literally broke their fragile backs, hauling massive, bone-crushing blocks of raw gray granite up crude, terrifyingly unstable wooden scaffolding that swayed and groaned sickeningly in the bitter, howling northern winds. Their hot, exhausted sweat mixed freely with the freezing, biting spray of the St. Lawrence River, soaking straight through their heavy wool coats as they risked their very lives every single day for a millionaire's terrifying delusion. The air around a rapidly rising fortress constantly echoed with the deafening, rhythmic cracking of heavy iron chisels against unyielding stone, a brutal, unending symphony of agonizing labor that never ceased from the pale dawn until the suffocating dusk. Inside the cavernous, shadowy, unfinished walls of the sprawling six-story behemoth, the suffocating, heavy stench of wet, chalky mortar, and freshly sawed rough pine hung thick and oppressive in the damp, freezing air. It was a visceral, inescapable testament to the relentless, bone-grinding pace of construction that George commanded with absolute, terrifying authority. He envisioned a sprawling, decadent paradise echoing with the joyous laughter of high society, demanding the creation of cavernous ballrooms that would eventually be adorned with priceless, imported French tapestries. He meticulously mapped out a private, subterranean bowling alley deep within the cold earth, and a massive indoor swimming pool that he swore would rival the most hedonistic, marble-clad baths of ancient Rome, complete with intricate mosaic tiles that took hundreds of hours to place entirely by hand. Yet, the reality of the colossal structure rising from the thick mud was deeply, unsettlingly sinister. To power this monstrous monument of excess, George ordered the construction of a towering, ominous powerhouse on the rocky edge of the island, bizarrely designed to perfectly mimic a fortified, ancient medieval keep. Its heavy, impenetrable stone walls and dark, narrow windows looked as though they were built to repel a violent, bloody siege rather than simply house modern steam generators and massive coal furnaces. The island was rapidly mutating into a nightmarish, fortified kingdom, bristling with aggressive defensive architecture that made absolutely no logical sense for a romantic summer home. High above the freezing, churning waters, highly paid European artisans spent hundreds of agonizing hours meticulously carving massive, grotesque stone gargoyles out of solid rock. These demonic, sneering figures were deliberately positioned to leer down over the cold, black river, their twisted, terrifying faces serving as silent, menacing guardians of George's obsessive, suffocating love. Every single heavy stone laid upon the frozen earth was supposedly a desperate, romantic love letter to his frail wife, Louise, but the colossal, heavy fortress taking shape looked absolutely nothing like a whimsical, idyllic retreat. Instead, it loomed over the scarred landscape as a dark, foreboding citadel, an inescapable, heavily fortified prison of affection that felt aggressively hostile to the entire outside world. As the massive, jagged turrets finally pierced the bleak, gray northern skyline, they began to cast long, suffocating, knife-like shadows across the dark water, stretching out over the currents like the grasping, desperate fingers of a drowning giant. The oppressive, heavy atmosphere of the island felt thick with an unspoken, creeping dread, as if this monstrous, sprawling castle was silently, patiently waiting for a brutal, bloody war that was never actually going to come. George paced relentlessly through the damp, echoing halls of his unfinished masterpiece, running his bare hands over the perfectly smoothed Italian marble, entirely blind to the terrifying, suffocating nature of the dark monument he was violently forcing into existence. He demanded that massive, load-bearing walls be violently smashed to pieces and entirely rebuilt from the ground up if a single imported tile was laid a fraction of an inch out of perfect alignment. His unchecked madness driving the exhausted, freezing workers to the absolute brink of human endurance. The island had become a terrifying, isolated world of its own, completely detached from reality, governed only by the ruthless, unyielding demands of a man desperately trying to physically construct a cage strong enough to trap time, beauty, and human mortality itself. But the cold, unforgiving river surrounding the island cared absolutely nothing for his millions of dollars, his sprawling, decadent blueprints, or his blinding arrogance. It simply continued to crash violently against the newly carved, unnatural stone walls, slowly eating away at the edges of his impossible dream, while the sneering, demonic stone gargoyles watched in cold, silent anticipation for the inevitable, catastrophic collapse of a man who foolishly dared to challenge the very laws of nature. Then came the bitter, unforgiving month of January in the year 1904, descending upon the St. Lawrence River like a suffocating shroud of solid ice, and bringing with it a catastrophic shockwave that would permanently paralyze the island in a state of rotting purgatory. The relentless, deafening symphony of heavy industrial labor was suddenly, violently severed by the arrival of a single, frantic telegram from the opulent, bustling heart of New York City. This fragile slip of yellow paper carried a message so utterly devastating that it seemed to stop the very flow of time itself, delivering a lethal electric pulse that instantly killed the grandest, most arrogant architectural dream of the Gilded Age. Louise Boldt was dead at the tragically young age of 41. Her fragile, exhausted human heart had catastrophically given out, surrendering to the dark void long before the colossal, unnatural stone heart of the island bearing its exact shape could ever be finished. The sickening, cruel irony of the sudden tragedy was absolute, proving with terrifying finality that while George could violently dynamite the ancient bedrock of the earth and command an army of 300 men to conquer the freezing waters, he possessed absolutely no power to halt the creeping, invisible hand of human mortality. The moment the fatal news reached the frozen, muddy shores of the island, the response from the grieving, shattered millionaire was chillingly brief and carried the heavy weight of an absolute, unbreakable decree. There would be no gradual winding down of the massive construction efforts, no careful securing of the exposed, vulnerable roofs against the brutal northern winter, and absolutely no final payroll distributed in the damp, echoing halls. George simply commanded every single worker to drop their heavy tools exactly where they stood and evacuate the island immediately. The scene that rapidly unfolded across the scarred, heart-shaped rock was nothing short of apocalyptic in its shocking, terrifying abruptness. It was as if an invisible, deadly plague had suddenly swept through the sprawling construction site, instantly erasing all human purpose and leaving behind a chaotic, frozen snapshot of violently interrupted life. Massive, heavy iron hammers were left resting uselessly on cold steel anvils, their smoothed wooden handles still warm from the desperate, sweating grip of the terrified blacksmiths. Colossal, half-carved blocks of imported gray limestone were simply abandoned in the freezing, churning mud, the intricate, delicate chisel marks of the master European masons left forever incomplete. Down by the icy, violently battered docks, the sheer, agonizing waste of the sudden exodus was truly sickening to behold. Massive, heavy wooden crates packed tightly with priceless, hand-woven French tapestries, delicate Italian marble tiles, and breathtaking Czechoslovakian crystal chandeliers were carelessly dumped on the slippery, frost-covered planks and left entirely to rot in the brutal, freezing spray of the Black River. The roaring, hellish fires in the massive industrial forges, which had burned furiously day and night to heat the thick iron rivets of the towering powerhouse, were simply abandoned, left to slowly suffocate in the freezing wind and burn down to sad mounds of cold, gray, lifeless ash. The echoing, hoarse shouts of the 300 desperate men, the terrifying screaming of the overloaded wooden pulleys, and the rhythmic, bone-rattling cracking of stone all vanished in the blink of an eye. The grand, sprawling fortress was instantly transformed from a bustling, chaotic temple of obsessive love into a colossal, chillingly silent tombstone. As the last steam-powered barge pulled away from the jagged, dynamited shores, carrying the confused, shivering army of laborers back to the distant mainland, an eerie, suffocating silence violently reclaimed the island. The only sound left to echo through the cavernous, unfinished ballrooms and the dark, subterranean tunnels was the terrifying, howling winter wind that relentlessly swept through the hundreds of hollow, glassless windows. The towering stone gargoyles, meticulously carved to protect a decadent paradise that would now never exist, leered out over a desolate, freezing wasteland, their sneering faces serving as the only silent witnesses to the sudden, catastrophic death of a millionaire's impossible dream. The sprawling six-story castle was left completely exposed and entirely defenseless, its raw pine beams and wet mortar instantly freezing in the bitter, biting January air. In a matter of mere hours, George Boldt's magnificent, arrogant attempt to physically conquer nature and build an immortal monument to his wife became a grotesque, decaying corpse of stone, abandoned to the dark, swirling currents of the river and the unforgiving, ravenous appetite of time itself. For 73 agonizing, unrelenting years following that catastrophic winter, the colossal, unfinished castle was left completely alone to rot, slowly transforming into a terrifying, decaying ghost ship anchored eternally in the freezing black currents of the St. Lawrence River. George Boldt, the ruthless visionary who had violently bent the earth to his will, never once returned to the cursed, heart-shaped shores of the island. He was entirely unable to look upon the monstrous, sprawling tombstone of his shattered dreams, cowardly leaving the massive stone fortress entirely at the merciless whims of the brutal elements and the sickening depths of human cruelty. Without the protective warmth of roaring hearths or the frantic maintenance of 300 devoted laborers, the harsh, unforgiving northern winters immediately began to tear savagely at the exposed, vulnerable wooden roofs. Relentless blizzards dumped crushing weights of ice and snow directly into the hollow, open corridors, allowing a creeping, toxic black mold to spread across the priceless, imported Italian marble like a dark, flesh-eating disease. The suffocating, heavy stench of violently rotting oak and foul, stagnant rainwater quickly filled the cavernous, echoing halls, completely replacing the fragrant scents of raw pine and fresh mortar with the sickening perfume of absolute, unchecked decay. The massive iron drawbridges, originally designed to keep the outside world at bay, rusted into useless, immovable husks, offering a silent, tragic invitation to the worst elements of society. Vandals, thieves, and thrill-seekers soon descended upon the isolated, undefended island like a swarm of ravenous scavengers picking clean a bloated, helpless corpse. They arrived under the cover of darkness in small, silent rowboats, their cruel, mocking laughter echoing through the empty, frozen ballrooms as they violently smashed the exquisite, handcrafted terracotta tiles simply for the sick thrill of destruction. These malicious trespassers scrawled crude, hateful vulgarities across the grand, intricately carved limestone fireplaces, deliberately desecrating the very stones that were meant to be a flawless monument to immortal love. They callously set blazing, destructive bonfires right in the middle of the sweeping grand staircases, using the abandoned, rotting crates of delicate French silks and expensive wooden scaffolding as convenient kindling. These reckless fires raged out of control, licking at the surviving timber and leaving behind deep, ugly black scorch marks that permanently scarred the elegant, imported stonework, transforming the intended romantic haven into a blackened, hellish nightmare. The once magnificent powerhouse, bizarrely designed as a proud medieval keep to pump electricity and life into the heart of the island, suffered a fate even more profoundly repulsive. Its heavy iron doors were violently ripped off their hinges and thrown into the churning river, allowing the dark, damp interior to become a foul, festering haven for thousands of screeching bats, feral animals, and disease-carrying vermin. The thick, stagnant air inside the towering stone structure grew sickeningly heavy with the suffocating, acidic smell of accumulated guano, wet fur, and festering decay, creating a toxic, unbreathable atmosphere that violently choked anyone foolish enough to step inside its shadows. Nature itself seemed to exact a violent, vengeful toll on the arrogant man-made intrusion, sending thick, thorny vines crawling aggressively up the exterior walls like grasping, skeletal fingers desperately trying to pull the entire massive structure down into the muddy, freezing earth. The intricate, sneering stone gargoyles, originally carved by master artisans to protect a decadent paradise, were slowly and mercilessly eroded by decades of biting acid rain and freezing winds. Their terrifying faces melted into featureless, pathetic lumps of gray rock that continuously wept dark, black streaks of dirt down the crumbling castle walls, as if the building itself were mourning its own agonizing, prolonged death. Every single agonizing year that passed stripped away another layer of George's blinding arrogance, exposing the fragile, pathetic reality of his impossible ambition to the unforgiving sky. The subterranean tunnels, once intended to be marvels of modern engineering, flooded entirely with freezing, muddy river water, becoming dark, treacherous death traps filled with rotting debris and submerged hazards. What was originally intended to be a pristine, eternal temple of immortal devotion had violently mutated into a grotesque, terrifying ruin that deeply repulsed the very soul of anyone who dared to look upon it. The colossal, six-story behemoth stood paralyzed in a state of eternal, rotting purgatory, its hundreds of empty, jagged windows staring out over the dark, churning water like the hollow, soulless eye sockets of a massive, decaying skull. The once bustling island became a dark, whispered legend among the locals, a cursed, heavily avoided dead zone where the crushing weight of profound human grief and catastrophic failure hung visibly in the damp, freezing air. There was absolutely no romance left in the crumbling, soot-stained stones, only the terrifying, inescapable truth that human obsession, no matter how heavily funded or fiercely pursued, eventually crumbles into foul, rotting dust beneath the relentless, grinding wheels of time. While his colossal, unfinished castle slowly crumbled into a terrifying, nightmare landscape of shattered, blackened stone and aggressively overgrown weeds, George Boldt violently locked himself away within the impenetrable, golden walls of his legendary empire of luxury. Hundreds of miles south of the freezing, churning currents of the St. Lawrence River, he desperately attempted to bury his suffocating, paralyzing grief beneath the relentless, grinding pursuit of unimaginable wealth. He continued to ruthlessly manage the most opulent, decadent hotels in the entire world, stalking through the pristine, marble-clad lobbies of the Waldorf Astoria like a beautifully dressed, hollow phantom. His daily existence was a masterclass in deliberate sensory overload, aggressively designed to completely drown out the horrifying, echoing silence of his colossal failure in the north. He surrounded himself entirely with the blinding, prismatic sparkle of massive crystal chandeliers, the rich, salty taste of the finest imported beluga caviar, and the intoxicating, heavy scent of expensive French perfumes worn by the elite socialites who flocked to his lavish dining rooms. Yet, despite the deafening, joyous music of the live string quartets and the endless, flowing rivers of expensive champagne, his shattered soul remained permanently, agonizingly tethered to that rotting, desolate island in the freezing water. The absolute, terrifying reality of his situation was that the brilliant, commanding visionary had become a helpless prisoner of his own broken mind. Dark, persistent rumors began to whisper like venomous snakes through the exclusive, tightly guarded circles of New York high society, carried behind silk fans and muttered over crystal glasses of expensive scotch. The wealthy elite whispered that the great millionaire was profoundly haunted, completely unable to escape the terrifying, phantom vision of the colossal, decaying ruin he had so abruptly abandoned to the elements. Terrified servants reported seeing him staring blankly out of his luxurious penthouse windows into the dark, smog-choked city sky, his eyes wide and hollow, as if he could clearly see the jagged, crumbling turrets of his monstrous tombstone rising violently above the Manhattan skyline. The sickening, visceral contrast between the bustling, golden halls of his manicured city life and the absolute, rotting silence of his abandoned island created a dark, festering secret that hid in plain sight. Every single time a blast of cold winter air slipped through the heavy velvet curtains of his hotel, George supposedly shivered with a creeping, visceral dread, instantly transported back to the biting, freezing spray of the river and the horrifying memory of the telegram that had violently ended his world. Driven by a desperate, borderline psychotic need to protect the decaying corpse of his masterpiece from the prying, mocking eyes of the outside world, he weaponized his immense fortune in a completely unprecedented and terrifying manner. He began hemorrhaging millions upon millions of dollars, aggressively buying up massive tracts of surrounding shoreline and neighboring islands in the Thousand Islands region. This frantic, obsessive purchasing spree was not a clever investment in future developments, but a terrifying, calculated quarantine of his own personal heartbreak. He erected a massive, invisible fortress of legal deeds and strict property lines, spending an absolute fortune simply to ensure that absolutely no one would ever dare to disturb the rotting, silent grave of his impossible dream. He hired ruthless private guards to patrol the perimeter of his newly acquired watery empire, creating a massive, heavily funded buffer zone of absolute isolation around the decaying stone monster. He was desperately trying to purchase oblivion, throwing endless mountains of cash at a gaping, bleeding wound in his soul that completely refused to heal. The sheer, sickening absurdity of a man spending millions of dollars just to isolate a pile of rotting, vandalized rocks perfectly illustrated the terrifying depths of his madness. His grand, opulent life in the city became nothing more than a beautifully gilded cage, a frantic, exhausting performance designed to mask the terrifying truth that he was just as dead inside as the hollow, glassless halls of his ruined castle. The intoxicating, perfumed air of the Waldorf Astoria could never truly mask the phantom stench of wet, rotting oak and stagnant rainwater that permanently haunted his every waking breath. George Boldt ultimately proved, through his tragic, suffocating final years, that absolutely no amount of hoarded gold, unbridled corporate power, or aggressive land acquisition could ever possibly buy a single, fleeting reprieve from the terrifying, absolute finality of human death. He lived out his remaining days as a hollow, haunted king, ruling over an empire of fleeting, superficial pleasures while his true, monstrous legacy continued to rot in the freezing, silent darkness, waiting patiently for the day when he, too, would finally succumb to the cold earth and join his wife in the eternal, suffocating void. Decades of unchecked decay eventually gave way to a bizarre, sanitized resurrection in the year 1977, when the colossal, rotting ruin was officially acquired by modern regional authorities for the sickeningly pathetic, almost mocking sum of exactly one single paper dollar. The terrifying ghost ship that had haunted the freezing currents of the St. Lawrence River for over 70 years was suddenly swarmed once again, this time by a massive army of modern contractors armed with chemical solvents, heavy steel scaffolding, and millions of dollars in government and private funding. They embarked on a relentless, aggressive campaign to violently scrub away the dark, festering history of the island, desperately trying to mask the chilling truth of the property beneath thick, suffocating coats of fresh paint and polished modern veneer. The toxic, creeping black mold that had entirely consumed the imported Italian marble was blasted away by high-pressure hoses, and the suffocating, acidic mountains of animal guano were shoveled out of the cavernous, echoing powerhouse and dumped into the dark, churning waters. Pristine, glittering panels of incredibly expensive stained glass were meticulously installed into the hundreds of hollow, jagged window frames that had stared blindly over the river for decades, finally sealing the massive interior off from the brutal, howling northern winds. Master carpenters were brought in to completely replace the violently scorched, rotting oak staircases, sanding and polishing the sweeping grand steps to a blinding, flawless sheen. Yet, despite this massive, highly funded injection of modern life and sanitized historical preservation, the sprawling six-story castle remains profoundly, terrifyingly empty at its very core. Today, fleets of modern, diesel-powered ferries continuously churn up the cold waters, delivering hundreds of thousands of chattering, brightly clothed tourists to the newly stabilized docks, eager to consume a sanitized, highly romanticized fairy tale. But the very second you actually step off the manicured lawns and cross the heavy, imposing stone threshold into the cavernous Grand Hall, the carefully constructed illusion of a beautiful love story instantly, violently shatters. A sudden, suffocating atmosphere violently grips your throat, a heavy, unseen, crushing pressure that instantly drops the ambient temperature and makes the hair on the back of your neck stand straight up in pure, primal terror. Beneath the aggressive, sterile scent of modern floor wax and fresh plaster, you can vividly smell the unmistakable, heavy stench of cold, dead stone, and deep, forgotten sorrow constantly leaking through the newly finished walls. The chattering voices and echoing footsteps of the guided tour groups sound completely wrong, bouncing off the polished marble with a harsh, metallic deadness that aggressively highlights the profound, unnatural silence of the massive structure. You look around the sprawling, beautifully restored ballrooms and the meticulously tiled indoor swimming pool, and a sudden, creeping dread violently washes over your entirely paralyzed body. You realize, with a sickening drop in your stomach, that this towering, majestic fortress is absolutely not a triumph of historical restoration, nor is it a beautiful testament to the enduring power of human devotion. It is a place that was never actually lived in for a single day, never once warmed by the comforting glow of a burning family hearth, and never filled with the joyous, echoing laughter it was so obsessively built to house. It is nothing more than a perfectly preserved, beautifully dressed stone corpse. No amount of millions of dollars, pristine colored glass, or brightly lit historical plaques can ever breathe a single ounce of genuine warmth into the hollow, dead veins of this sprawling monster. The sheer, blinding hubris of George Boldt's manic vision becomes terrifyingly clear as you stand completely frozen in the center of his empty, echoing masterpiece. He poured his immense, unchecked fortune into dynamiting the earth and conquering the freezing waters to build an immortal, impenetrable cage for his love, only to have the entire universe violently reject his arrogance. The beautifully restored castle stands today as the largest, most elaborate, and most deeply tragic tombstone ever violently forced into the surface of the earth. It is a chilling, permanent monument to a love so heavy, demanding, and utterly obsessive that it foolishly tried to conquer the very laws of nature, only to be effortlessly, catastrophically crushed by the sudden, suffocating silence of a single, fragile human heartbeat. As you finally turn your back on the sweeping grand staircase and flee back into the biting northern air, desperately seeking the safety of the modern ferry, you cannot shake the terrifying feeling of being watched by the cold, heavy stones themselves. The pristine, soulless monster remains securely anchored to its blasted, unnatural rock, completely devoid of life, staring eternally out over the freezing, ink-black waters of the river, waiting in absolute, agonizing silence for a master who will never, ever return.